Pompey's escape across the Adriatic marked the moment when Caesar realized the civil war would not be won in a single lightning stroke. He had chased Pompey all the way to Brundisium, only to watch him slip away under cover of darkness. Pompey carried off nearly every seaworthy ship, leaving Caesar staring at an empty harbor. He could not pursue, not yet. The sea belonged to his rival, and without a fleet, there was nothing to gain by waiting on the Italian coast. So Caesar turned to the only option left: prepare for a long war. He sent word through Italy and Gaul, telling magistrates, ship owners, and allied communities to gather vessels at Brundisium. Every galley, every transport, every fishing boat that could hold together on open water mattered now. But a fleet would take time to assemble, and Pompey was already across the sea. He was raising new armies in Greece, calling in debts, pulling on the loyalty of Eastern kings and governors. Each week gave him strength. Caesar knew he could not simply stand idle. If Pompey gathered power in the east, his western armies would act in tandem, and those forces were no small threat. In Spain, Pompey held a massive concentration of troops: 7 legions under Marius Petreius, Lucius Afranius, and Marcus Varro. That force outnumbered anything Caesar had in the region. These legions were not raw recruits. They were hardened by years of fighting mountain tribes and desert raiders. If Spain rose against him, Gaul would be in danger. Even Italy would lie open. Caesar had to act first. Before leaving for Spain, he made a decision he had tried to avoid. Since crossing the Rubicon, he had stayed away from Rome to preserve his proconsular authority. But his earlier hope of capturing Pompey quickly had evaporated. If the war stretched on, he needed money, legions, and control. So he entered the capital. It was a shocking move, but Caesar walked straight into the city and took command of the treasury. Gold and silver were hauled out from vaults that had not been opened in generations. He even seized wealth from several temples, ignoring protests from priests and senators who remained in Rome. It was a clear sign. He was done pretending this was a brief political dispute. This was a full civil war. With funds secured, Caesar turned to Rome's survival. If Pompey or his supporters cut off the grain supply, the capital would starve. So Caesar sent his legates out across the western Mediterranean. Quintus Valerius Orca sailed for Sardinia with a legion. Gaius Curio took 3 and headed towards Sicily, then planned to push on to Africa, where another Pompeian governor held the province. At the same time, Gaius Antonius moved north to guard the mountain passes, blocking any attempt by Pompey's Italian followers to slip back into the peninsula. Mark Antony and Marcus Lepidus stayed behind to keep order in Italy, while Publius Dolabella took charge of building the fleet that would one day challenge Pompey for control of the Adriatic. Only once all this machinery was in motion did Caesar leave Rome. He marched north with 2 new legions, intending to join the 7 he had left in Gaul. The combined army would then sweep into Spain, but as he reached Narbonese Gaul, something unexpected stopped him. The city of Massilia, modern Marseille, refused him entry. Caesar had passed through many towns since crossing the Rubicon, and most had opened their gates immediately. Massilia did not. Its elders declared they would remain neutral. They claimed no loyalty to Pompey, but they refused to receive Caesar either. It was a polite lie. The city had been preparing for war. They had stockpiled grain from the countryside. They gathered timber and metal for weapons. They hired mercenaries from the local tribes. They reinforced their walls and readied their fleet. And as Caesar waited for the council's decision, a familiar face arrived by sea. Lucius Domitius Ahenobarbus, the same man Caesar had captured and spared at Corfinium. Domitius persuaded the Massilians to side openly with Pompey. The city appointed him commander, and allowed him to take control of their defenses. Caesar could not ignore this defiance. Massilia sat astride the coastal route between Italy and Spain. If he left it untouched, Pompey's allies could cut his supply lines or strike at his rear. So Caesar ordered preparations for a siege, but he refused to lose time. While the works took shape, he sent his trusted lieutenant Fabius forward with 3 legions. Their orders were simple: secure the passes through the Pyrenees and push Afranius's scouts away from the mountains. More legions from Gaul were on the way. Once they arrived, Caesar planned to rejoin the column and strike deep into Spain. A month passed before he left Massilia, leaving 3 legions and 2 commanders, Decimus Brutus and Trebonius, to continue the siege. Caesar rode ahead with only his personal guard and 1,000 Gallic cavalry. Spain waited. Pompey's armies were spread across the peninsula in a great arc. Varro held the south with a sizable force. Petreius guarded the west. Afranius, the senior commander, controlled the north from a strong position near Ilerda. When they learned Caesar was coming, Petreius marched north to join Afranius. Together they formed a combined force so large it seemed to outweigh the entire countryside. Their veterans were confident and disciplined, and the land itself favored them. They took a commanding hill south of Ilerda, guarded the only stone bridge across the Segre River, and sent patrols sweeping across both banks to gather every stalk of grain. By the time Fabius arrived with his own army, an enormous column of infantry, cavalry, and auxiliaries, the western bank was bare. His men built bridges and crossed without resistance, but food ran short within days. Foraging parties clashed often with Pompey's cavalry. Each time, Fabius had to send more men to protect his own supply gatherers. The skirmishes intensified until a violent storm swept through the valley and tore down one of the wooden bridges. 2 of Fabius's legions were cut off on the far bank. Afranius saw the opportunity instantly. He marched with nearly his entire force, hoping to overwhelm the isolated troops before Fabius could reach them. But the Caesarian detachment, led by Lucius Plancus, seized a nearby hill and formed a tight defensive ring. When Fabius realized what had happened, he sent reinforcements across the northern bridge. The lines met just in time. Afranius, unwilling to risk a major fight, withdrew. 2 days later, Caesar arrived. He brought his guard, his cavalry, and his energy. He marched at once to meet Afranius and Petreius, forming his lines within sight of theirs. But neither side moved. Afranius held high ground and would not surrender it. Caesar watched, waited, and prepared something else, something subtle. What happened next would reshape the entire campaign. What happened next would sharpen the contest into a battle of wills, one where movement, patience, and nerve mattered more than any clash of lines. Caesar understood Afranius's position. The Pompeian camp sat on a ridge with a clear view of the plain. If Caesar launched a frontal assault, his men would have to run uphill under volleys of missiles. He refused to pay that price. Instead, he placed his first 2 lines in formation, holding the enemy's gaze. Then he ordered his 3rd line to start digging. It was a quiet maneuver at first, a long trench cut across the field, screened by the soldiers standing ready for battle. Afranius mistook this caution for hesitation. By the time he realized what Caesar was doing, the trench was nearly complete. That night, instead of returning to their original camp, Caesar's men stayed behind the new defenses. At dawn, they expanded the works in full view. A new camp rose just a stone's throw from Afranius's lines. Now the staring contest had tightened into a contest of supply. Caesar was short on food. Afranius was not. Inside Ilerda lay mountains of grain and provisions gathered from the countryside. Caesar's only chance was to cut the Pompeians off from the city, and to do that, he needed a hill located between the city walls and Afranius's ridge. So Caesar moved. He sent 3 legions toward the hill. Light troops ran ahead, hoping to seize the crest before Afranius reacted. But Afranius saw the danger instantly. He rushed cohorts forward and reached the hill first. The fight that followed was sharp and unpredictable. Pompey's veterans fought in a style copied from Iberian tribes, breaking into small groups that hurled javelins, darted backward, then surged again before Caesar's men could stabilize their line. The unusual rhythm unsettled the Caesarians. Their formation bent, then wavered. Caesar sent in the 9th Legion. Their charge steadied the front and drove the Pompeians off the hill. As the enemy fell back toward Ilerda, Caesar's soldiers pressed the pursuit. They believed the retreat was genuine, that the fight was already won. But when they reached the foot of the city walls, arrows and javelins rained down from above. The narrow ground left no room for cavalry. For hours, the 9th Legion fought without support, taking fire from the battlements and battling the cohorts defending the gate. Only when the cavalry finally found a way to cover their withdrawal did the exhausted legionaries pull back. In his own writings, Caesar called the engagement a victory. But the truth was harder. He had failed to take the hill. And that night, Afranius retook it quietly. Caesar had lost his first real clash near Ilerda. Soon the weather turned. Snow melted in the mountains and poured into the Segre River. Spring storms hammered the valley. Floodwater swept away both wooden bridges Caesar's engineers had built. His army was stranded on the western bank. There was nothing left to forage. The land had been stripped clean. Afranius, meanwhile, had the stone bridge and the city stores. Every time Caesar tried to rebuild a crossing, archers on the opposite bank drove his workers off. Worse still, a supply convoy approached with badly needed food, and Caesar's men could not reach it. Afranius sent cavalry to intercept the convoy. But the Gallic horsemen escorting it fought fiercely. They beat off the attackers and retreated into the mountains, though they lost many riders in the process. Afranius sent infantry to finish them, but when he saw the rugged position the Gauls held, he withdrew. His cavalry, battered by the earlier fight, took no further action. It looked as if Afranius had trapped Caesar, but Caesar was not finished. He ordered his troops to build coracles, light boats made from willow frames and animal hides. One night, a legion marched upriver with these strange craft strapped to wagons. They slipped past Afranius's scouts, crossed the river, and dug in on the eastern bank. Using their fortified position, they began building a new bridge. Within 2 days, the crossing stood firm. The convoy crossed at once, escorted by the Gallic cavalry, and reached Caesar's camp safely. With food restored, Caesar went on the offensive. His cavalry launched sudden raids on Afranius's foraging parties. The Pompeians, already weakened, could no longer protect their own supply gatherers. Their access to food shrank with each day. Local tribes, watching the tide shift, began to send envoys to Caesar. They offered grain, livestock, and guides. Even the land was turning against Afranius. Still, Afranius had one advantage. Caesar's cavalry could not reach the enemy quickly enough across the deep river, so Caesar made a decision that would have seemed impossible to anyone who had not seen his legions work before. He ordered a portion of the river diverted. His men dug channels north of Ilerda. They drove stakes, cut new banks, and guided the water into a wide trench. By the time Afranius realized what they were doing, the river level had dropped. The cavalry could now ford it with ease. Pressure closed in on the Pompeians. Afranius and Petreius met in council. They knew that staying near Ilerda meant starvation. Their only hope was to escape south and join Varro. The land there favored them. They could call on loyal communities, secure new provisions, and stretch the campaign into winter. So they sent word to Varro, build a pontoon bridge across the Ebro. Then they prepared to withdraw. They planned carefully. Petreius sent troops to build fortifications on the eastern bank of the Segre, shielding the army while it crossed the stone bridge. Caesar learned of these plans through deserters and scouts, but he could not stop the escape. The diverted river was shallow enough for cavalry, but the infantry still could not cross quickly. The moment the Ebro crossing was ready, Afranius and Petreius moved. They broke camp at night. Their column wound south through the dark, carrying only a few days' worth of food. A small garrison remained behind in Ilerda. Caesar responded instantly. His cavalry surged out, hounding the retreating column. They fired javelins from a safe distance, slowing the Pompeians without committing to close combat. Their goal was simple: delay the march long enough for the infantry to catch up. By sunrise, the rear of Afranius's column could still be seen from Caesar's camp. The river had dropped just enough that the deepest point barely rose to a man's chest. Caesar's legionaries pleaded to cross. At last he agreed. Horses were stationed upstream to break the current, and downstream to catch any man swept away. The army crossed without loss. Then they pushed south at a forced march, closing the distance. Afranius had no choice. He drew up his troops to face Caesar. But Caesar refused battle. His men had marched hard, crossed a river, and dug fieldworks, all in one day. They needed rest. Scouts brought reports that only one passable route lay ahead, a narrow defile. Whoever reached it first would hold the key to the entire south. Even a small force could block it. For Afranius, it meant survival. For Caesar, victory. What followed was a contest of speed, deception, and endurance, one that would push both armies to their limits. What followed was a test of endurance that pushed both armies toward the breaking point, and it began with a deception. At dawn, Afranius's scouts watched Caesar's men pack their gear and march back toward Ilerda. It looked like a retreat. It looked like Caesar had finally been beaten by hunger, by weather, by the long march. And that, of course, was exactly what he wanted them to believe. Caesar had no intention of falling back. His real plan was simple but bold. He knew the main road south was blocked by Afranius's vanguard. So instead of using it, he took his men on a brutal shortcut over steep, broken hills. It was a path almost no commander would have chosen. The slopes were sharp. The ground was uneven. Packs slipped. Shields cracked. But the legions pressed on, driven by Caesar's urgency. Before long, scouts from Afranius's camp realized the truth. Caesar was not retreating. He was racing them to the pass. Afranius broke camp at once. His troops hurried south, but Caesar's cavalry shadowed them. Again and again, the Pompeian column stopped to fend off hit-and-run attacks. Each pause cost precious minutes. Each clash drained energy. The delays were enough. Caesar's men climbed relentlessly and reached the high ground first. They blocked the road. The Pompeian army, caught in the open, faced a narrow gateway now held by their enemy. Caesar did not press an attack. Instead, he stopped and let his men breathe after the brutal march. The defile was his. Afranius had lost the race. Seeing the trap close, Afranius searched for an escape. He ordered a detachment of auxiliaries to seize a ridge overlooking a mountain trail. If they could take that height, the main army might slip past. But Caesar's cavalry struck before the troops could form up. They scattered the auxiliaries and sealed the last path south. The Pompeian army was pinned. The field seemed ready for a decisive battle. Caesar's soldiers were eager. Their confidence rose with every success. But Caesar himself had no desire to spill Roman blood if he could avoid it. He had maneuvered Afranius into a hopeless position. A slaughter now would waste the advantage he had gained through weeks of endurance and precision. So he held back. Instead, he left one avenue open, not south, but backward. Afranius could only return to the camp he had abandoned that morning. It was a silent signal. Caesar was telling them the war did not need to end in carnage. Afranius and Petreius met in council. Their situation was deteriorating fast. Their troops were hungry. Their horses were exhausted. Worse, they had almost no access to water. Every attempt to reach the river ended in chaos. Caesar's cavalry hovered constantly, swooping down on water carriers and scattering them before they could fill even a single flask. To solve this, the Pompeian commanders posted guards along the riverbank and ordered a defensive rampart built. They inspected the work themselves, walking among their men, reminding them of Pompey's name, urging them to hold on a little longer. But while Petreius was away from the main camp, something unexpected happened. Soldiers from both armies began talking. At first, it was small things. A question shouted across the gap. A joke shared between men who had fought together in Gaul years earlier. Then centurions joined, then tribunes. Roman spoke to Roman, and old loyalties resurfaced. They asked about terms. They asked about surrender. They asked if Caesar's mercy at Corfinium still held true here. For a moment, it seemed the war in Spain might end without another step. But Petreius returned. He saw clusters of men mingling. He saw Caesarian soldiers inside the fringe of the Pompeian camp. He reacted instantly. He seized a sword and drove Caesar's men out by force. Then he gathered his entire army, formed them into ranks, and made them renew their oath to Pompey. Not quietly, but aloud, line by line, under the eyes of their officers. The brief hope for peace vanished. The stalemate that followed stretched for days. Afranius's troops tried to forage. Caesar's cavalry struck them each time. The auxiliaries began to starve first. Many fled to Caesar's lines, stumbling in with empty packs and hollow faces. The legions suffered next. They had left Ilerda with enough food for only a short march. Those rations were gone. Hunger spread through the army like a second enemy. At last, Afranius and Petreius chose to withdraw toward Ilerda. They had no choice. They needed the stores locked behind its walls. They broke camp and marched. Caesar responded within moments. His cavalry launched a relentless pursuit, never fully engaging, but always close, always pressing, always slowing the Pompeians. Afranius never reached Ilerda. Each time he tried to gain ground, Caesar's riders harassed the flanks. Each time the column formed up, Caesar's infantry drew closer. At last, the Pompeians halted in open ground and threw up a temporary camp. But it was in a terrible position, far from water, exposed to the wind, and watched by Caesar's scouts from every rise. This, Caesar understood, was the moment the campaign had been driving toward. He did not attack. He ordered trenches instead. Long lines of earthworks reached toward the Pompeian camp, closing the circle hour by hour. Afranius tried to break the encirclement. He drew up his troops in battle formation. Caesar matched the formation immediately. Yet again, neither side charged. Caesar still sought a bloodless victory. Inside the Pompeian camp, the mood collapsed. Food was gone. Water was scarce. Desertions grew. Officers argued. Men lay in the dust, too weak to stand. Afranius and Petreius saw the truth. They could not fight, could not flee, could not forage. The war in Spain was over. They sent envoys. At first, the two commanders tried to negotiate a private agreement, hoping to secure lenient terms without losing face. But Caesar refused secrecy. He insisted the surrender be public, witnessed by officers from both armies. His aim was clear: to end the conflict openly, to dissolve Pompey's Spanish legions without force, and to absorb their strength into his own. The next day, the Pompeian army capitulated. Caesar disbanded the legions but welcomed any soldier who wanted to join him. Many did. Others returned home. Not a single execution was ordered. Not a single centurion was punished. Caesar had won by movement, patience, and pressure, not slaughter. The fall of Afranius and Petreius shattered Pompey's western command. News spread like fire through the south of Spain. Varro, isolated and already losing the loyalty of his towns, saw one of his legions defect outright. Cities rose against Pompeian garrisons. Gates were barred. Grain was denied. Even Gades, where Varro held a fleet and a treasury, declared for Caesar. Varro surrendered. Caesar moved through the great cities, Gades, Corduba, Tarraco, restoring order and setting new governors in place. He placed Quintus Cassius Longinus over the south, then turned back toward Italy. His path would take him once more past the walls of Massilia, where his siege remained unfinished. And even there, events were unfolding that would shape the next stage of the war. The siege of Massilia had continued in Caesar's absence, and the city's fate would become a fitting epilogue to the long campaign in Spain. When Caesar first left for the Iberian front, the Massilians still believed their walls, their fleet, and their alliance with Domitius Ahenobarbus would save them. The city was rich, old, and proud. Its harbors were lined with merchant ships, its people were seasoned sailors, and its position along the coast gave it a natural advantage. They believed that if they held out long enough, Pompey would return as he had promised. But time was not on their side, and as Caesar marched through Spain, the siege at Massilia tightened like a slowly closing fist. Brutus and Trebonius commanded the siege works. They were not as charismatic as Caesar, but they were methodical. Under their orders, timber from the surrounding countryside became towers, galleries, and rams. Earthworks crept toward the walls day by day. The Romans built huge platforms mounted with artillery, hurling stones and bolts that shook the Massilian battlements. The defenders answered with engines of their own, launching firepots and heavy rocks that thudded against Roman shields and tore holes in wooden structures. The siege turned into a grinding duel between engineering and resolve. And then came the naval battles. Domitius had refitted the city's fleet, sharpening prows and reinforcing decks. Confident in his sailors, he ventured out to break the blockade. Brutus countered with ships borrowed from the Ligurian coast, heavier vessels, less nimble, but more stable in a ramming fight. The first clash filled the sea with shattered oars and drifting beams as both sides fought to control the harbor mouth. The Massilians managed to slip several galleys through the Roman line, but they could not dislodge the blockade entirely. A second battle ended with Domitius's flagship battered and half sunk. He barely escaped the wreck. The defeat shook the last of the city's optimism. When Caesar finished his march through Spain, his authority restored across the entire peninsula, he turned back toward Massilia. Everywhere he passed, the roads were lined with men who had surrendered to him, some now wearing his colors, some still looking to him for instruction. He moved with the calm assurance of a commander who had bent a continent to his will in a matter of months. By the time he reached the siege lines, the struggle had already entered its final stage. The Massilians were gaunt. Their supplies were nearly gone. Their walls sagged in places where Roman engines had struck them repeatedly. The great towers Brutus built now cast long shadows over the battlements. Every morning, the defenders watched more earthworks rise. Every night, they heard the clatter of tools as Romans worked under cover of darkness. They could not fight forever. Seeing Caesar return broke the last piece of their resistance. They surrendered the very day he arrived, yielding their arms, ships, and walls. Caesar spared the city, allowing them to keep their local laws and customs. He knew mercy would matter more than destruction. His real war lay elsewhere. He had already conquered Spain. Now he needed to confront the man who had once been his ally, his mentor, and his son-in-law, Gnaeus Pompeius Magnus. But Pompey was in Greece, and Caesar still lacked a fleet strong enough to challenge him. Dolabella's work continued. Shipyards along Italy's coast hammered day and night. Timber floated down the rivers from the Apennines. Rope makers, smiths, carpenters, and sailors all labored under constant pressure. Caesar needed ships, many ships, and each day lost gave Pompey time to gather new allies. Even so, the victory in Spain had changed the war. Caesar now held three key advantages. First, he controlled the western provinces, Gaul, Spain, and Italy, forming a unified bloc of manpower and supply. Second, he possessed a loyal army, seasoned by years of campaigning and bound to him personally. And third, he had shown the world that Pompey's legions could be outmaneuvered, outmatched, and even starved into surrender. Yet Caesar knew the next stage would be far harder. Pompey had not wasted his time in Greece. Governors from Asia, Syria, and Achaia had already answered his call. Kings and client rulers contributed ships and auxiliary troops. Wealth from the eastern provinces flowed into Pompey's treasury. Young nobles fled Italy to join him, eager to fight for the Senate's cause. By the summer of that year, Pompey commanded a force that dwarfed any he had led before. Caesar understood this, and the more he studied the situation, the clearer it became. He could not defeat Pompey by marching straight into his waiting armies. He would need to cross the sea, strike fast, and unsettle the very ground Pompey stood on. For that, he needed his fleet. He left Massilia behind and headed toward Rome once more, moving through the same provinces he had secured at the start of the campaign. But now the land felt different. The people no longer watched him with caution. They greeted him as the undisputed master of the West. Along the way, he reorganized local councils, confirmed loyal magistrates, and rewarded communities that had supported his march. When he reached Rome, he found a city transformed. Markets were busier. Merchants felt secure. Grain ships from Sardinia and Sicily arrived without incident, for Caesar's legates had seized those islands months earlier. The treasury was under his control, and the Senate, what remained of it in the capital, cooperated out of necessity. They did not love Caesar, but they feared instability more. Caesar used his time in Rome with purpose. He restructured debts. He passed measures to calm the urban poor. He reassured Italian allies that their rights were safe. Above all, he presented himself not as a conqueror, but as a stabilizer, a man who would bring order after years of uncertainty. But the war was far from over. Every letter from the east spoke of Pompey's growing strength. Every report from Dolabella's shipyards brought news of delays, repairs, shortages. Caesar pushed hard. He visited the coast. He inspected hulls, questioned craftsmen, and even helped drag newly finished ships down the ramps with his own hands. His soldiers copied him, laughing as they heaved ropes and shouted over the crash of waves. Caesar understood the power of example. A general who shared the strain of his army gained what no gold could buy: devotion. Day by day, the fleet grew, and as the ships took shape, Caesar looked across the sea and imagined what lay ahead. Mountain passes, Greek plains, fortified cities, and finally, a confrontation with the man who had once been Rome's greatest champion. Spain had been a campaign of endurance. Massilia had been a test of resolve. But the war that waited across the Adriatic would be different. Faster, sharper, colder. Caesar knew that the greatest battle of the Civil War still lay before him, and every hour of preparation would decide how and where he would strike when the time came. Caesar knew the greatest battle of the Civil War still lay before him. Yet before he crossed the Adriatic, the path that led him there would reveal just how thin the line was between daring and disaster. The fleet grew slowly, slower than Caesar wished. Timber arrived late. Ropes frayed, nails bent, storms battered half-finished hulls along the coast. Even as carpenters worked without pause, Caesar understood that his window was narrowing. Pompey continued to gather forces in Greece. His camp had become a magnet for every senator opposed to Caesar, every noble seeking prestige, every ambitious commander hoping to rise through allegiance to the old republic. As the months passed, the strength of the East loomed larger. Still, Caesar pressed forward. He traveled constantly between the coastal shipyards and his legions, encouraging, inspecting, pushing. Each new galley launched felt like a small victory. Each transport completed meant more men could follow him when the time came. The soldiers sensed his urgency. They mimicked him, tightening rigging, dragging keels, sealing planks with pitch. They joked that Caesar wanted to turn every man in the army into a sailor. But beneath the laughter ran a quiet, steady resolve. For once the fleet was ready, the real challenge would begin. Across the water, Pompey held every advantage. He commanded a navy nearly 3 times larger than anything Caesar could assemble. His ships patrolled the Adriatic like wolves marking their territory. They watched every inlet and cove from Greece to the coast of Epirus. Caesar could not expect to slip through unseen. He would need speed, luck, and nerve, and even then, the crossing might scatter his troops or split them entirely. Yet Caesar also knew something else, something that mattered more than numbers. Pompey had not commanded a true campaign for years. His victories were old ones, from distant wars in Spain and the East. His men respected him, yes, but they did not feel the same fire that Caesar's legions carried. Caesar's soldiers had crossed rivers in winter, starved in the mountains, marched through storms, fought battles on bridges barely standing above floodwaters. They had chased Afranius, cornered Petreius, shattered Varro's command, and subdued entire provinces. Their confidence was iron, and confidence could be a weapon all its own. As the fleet neared completion, Caesar split his legions among Italy's coastal camps. Some drilled daily with boarding hooks and light javelins. Others practiced disembarking from the low transport ramps, jumping into the surf with shields high and swords ready. The training was relentless. Officers drilled their men on how to hold formation on unsteady decks, how to brace for the shock of a ram, how to fight in close quarters aboard a rocking ship. Many soldiers had never set foot on a war galley before. Caesar needed them steady from the first wave. Meanwhile, reports from Greece painted a picture of growing tension. Pompey's officers argued constantly, some urging him to strike across the sea and invade Italy, others advising caution, others consumed with jealousy over who commanded the cavalry or controlled the supply lines. Senators complained about rations. Governors bickered over who would hold the left wing in the coming battle. And while Pompey listened to each voice, he made few decisions. He waited. He prepared. He strengthened his position, but he did not move. To Caesar, the hesitation was a gift, but gifts could not be counted on forever. Finally, after months of frantic labor, the fleet was ready. Not perfect, not as large as Caesar had hoped, but ready. enough ships to carry a single wave of legions across the Adriatic in one strike. The rest would follow later, once the route was secure, or once Pompey's navy had been forced aside. Caesar gathered his commanders. He spoke plainly. There could be no half measures. They would sail at night, under cover of winter storms that would keep Pompey's larger ships in harbor. They would land fast, seize high ground, and force Pompey to shift his attention away from the sea. The goal was not simply to land. It was to break the rhythm of Pompey's preparations, to make the enemy react, to turn the entire campaign from Pompey's quiet waiting into Caesar's relentless advance. The officers nodded. They understood the risk. Caesar moved his chosen legions to the coast, marching them in small groups to avoid detection. The night of departure arrived, a cold, wind-whipped night with waves slapping sharply against the rocks. The signal fire burned briefly along the shore, shielded from view except by those who needed to see it. The soldiers embarked. They moved quickly, silently, climbing aboard the galleys and transports that crowded the narrow harbor. Oarsmen gripped their benches. Captains barked hushed orders. Sails were kept furled, ready to unfurl only once the fleet had crept past the headlands. Then the first drumbeat sounded, slow, steady, deliberate. Oars dipped. The ships slid into deeper water. One by one, the hulls vanished into darkness, swallowed by the vast, restless sweep of the Adriatic. Caesar stood at the prow of his flagship. Spray whipped across his cloak. Wind struck his face. He stared toward the east, toward the land where Pompey waited, toward the next stage of the civil war. But even as the fleet pushed farther from Italy, Caesar knew the hardest part of the crossing lay ahead. Winter seas could splinter ships in a heartbeat. A sudden gale could scatter the entire invasion force across the coast. And Pompey's navy, though grounded for the moment, would surely discover the crossing by dawn. Success depended on outpacing that discovery. The fleet pressed on. Hour after hour, the ships rose and fell with the waves. Torches were kept hooded. The sea glowed faintly under the moon, broken by the rhythmic rise of oars. Caesar moved among the men, speaking to them in low tones, reminding them of their victories, of the trust he placed in them, of the moment that awaited them beyond the horizon. Even the veterans felt the tension. They had crossed many rivers with Caesar, but this sea felt different, wider, deeper, colder. A barrier not just of water, but of fate. For beyond it waited the greatest commander of the Republic, Pompey the Great, backed by nations, wealth, and armies that filled entire coastlines. Yet every man aboard knew one truth. They were following Caesar, and Caesar always found a way through. They were following Caesar, and Caesar always found a way through. But as the dark coast of Epirus slowly took shape ahead of the fleet, the truth became clear. Reaching Greece was only the beginning. The landing itself was a test of nerve. Caesar's ships crept toward a narrow stretch of shoreline near the port of Oricum. The sea was rough. The wind pressed against the hulls. Rocks waited beneath the waves like hidden teeth. But no Pompeian ships appeared. No patrol fires burned along the cliffs. The gamble had worked. The winter storm that threatened to scatter Caesar's own fleet had forced Pompey's navy to remain in safer harbors farther south. One by one, the Roman transports grounded in the shallows. Soldiers leapt into the surf with shields raised, boots sinking into wet sand. Officers shouted. Cohorts formed ranks, and as the last galley nudged ashore, Caesar stepped down into the icy water, wading forward with the calm stride of a man who had crossed far greater dangers. The beach belonged to him. At once, the soldiers fanned out, securing the hills above the landing site. Skirmishers sprinted ahead to probe the nearby roads. The standard-bearers planted their poles in the wet sand as if staking a claim on the future. Caesar wasted no time. He climbed the slope overlooking the sea and studied the landscape. Valleys, ridges, a distant cluster of walls that marked Oricum itself. Time mattered more than anything now. Pompey would soon learn of the landing. Scouts, fishermen, merchants, someone would carry word south. Before that news reached him, Caesar needed to seize strongpoints, secure food, and gather local allies. He did what he had always done in uncertain territory. He moved fast. Oricum surrendered without a fight. The townspeople, surprised and unsure, opened their gates to avoid destruction. Caesar treated them with care. No plunder, no executions. He needed stability, not ruins. He left a garrison and pushed inland toward Apollonia, a city of noble lineage and deep Greek pride. There, too, fortune favored him. The elders of Apollonia gathered as Caesar approached. They spoke in quiet tones, weighing risk and duty. Pompey was powerful, yes, but Caesar was here, at their gates. His soldiers marched in disciplined lines. His cavalry swept across the fields like watchful hawks. After a short deliberation, they opened their gates as well. A pattern was taking shape. Caesar advanced. Cities yielded. Roads opened. Local tribes sent envoys. And with each step, Caesar's foothold on the Greek coast strengthened. Yet even as he gained ground, he faced a critical weakness. He had brought only a portion of his army across the Adriatic. Most of his legions, seasoned veterans who had followed him through Gaul and Spain, were still in Italy. They waited with Mark Antony for the second wave of ships. But Antony could not sail. Pompey's navy had finally moved. Blockade lines stretched across the Adriatic. Patrols swept the coastline. Galleys hunted for any sign of Caesar's transport ships. The sea, which had delivered Caesar into Greece, now trapped the rest of his strength on the far shore. For the first time in the campaign, Caesar could not rely on speed alone. His position was bold, but fragile. Pompey commanded the high interior, holding Dyrrachium, the strongest fortified point on the coast. From there he could strike south. If he marched swiftly, he could crush Caesar's isolated force before Antony ever crossed with reinforcements. And so began the tense, shifting dance that would define the next phase of the civil war. Caesar marched north toward Dyrrachium, hoping to seize it before Pompey could gather his full strength. But Pompey, warned by riders and scouts, moved just as quickly. He slipped into the fortress city barely ahead of Caesar and settled into a defensive posture. For days, the two armies watched each other from the heights and valleys around Dyrrachium. Caesar probed the hills. Pompey reinforced them. Caesar led sudden night marches to cut supply roads. Pompey countered with cavalry raids, harassing Caesar's scouts. Every movement was a test. Every hesitation carried weight. But Caesar held one advantage: initiative. He acted first. Pompey responded. Caesar shifted. Pompey adjusted. It was like watching a masterful chess game played across entire provinces, with legions for pieces and the Adriatic for a board. Yet strategy alone could not overcome Caesar's greatest problem: the absence of Antony and the rest of the army. Without them, Caesar risked exhaustion, attrition, and total encirclement. But he refused to retreat. Instead, he chose audacity. Caesar moved around Dyrrachium and began constructing a massive line of fortifications, walls, trenches, outposts, encircling Pompey's position. It was a reversal so shocking that many later historians would call it one of the boldest maneuvers in ancient warfare. Caesar, with fewer troops, with weaker supply, with enemy cavalry breathing down his neck, attempted to hem in Pompey the Great. The work was brutal. Under constant harassment, the soldiers dug and hauled stone, building miles of earthworks. They slept little, fought often, and worked continuously. Pompey's cavalry attacked supply parties. His slingers pelted the Roman lines. His archers struck from hidden ridges. But still, Caesar's men continued, stretching their walls farther across the countryside. Pompey, now on the defensive, saw the danger. If Caesar succeeded, if the encirclement closed, he would lose the mobility on which his strategy depended. His allies would lose faith. His eastern armies would see a cage instead of a command tent. He could not allow that to happen. So Pompey hit back. He struck at outposts. He cut through partially completed trenches. He mounted sudden assaults on construction teams. The battles grew sharper, closer, more violent. Caesar rode constantly between positions, urging, correcting, reinforcing. He fought not to complete the ring, but to keep Pompey reacting, to keep him uncertain. Though Caesar always preferred movement to stagnation, he realized the truth. This part of the war would not be won in a few swift marches. Pompey commanded the sea. Pompey controlled the strongest fortress on the coast, and Pompey had allies streaming in from across the eastern world. But Caesar had something Pompey lacked: unity. His troops moved as one. They believed in him. They knew his voice, his temper, his humor, his resolve. They had crossed the Rubicon with him. They had crushed the Spanish legions. They had survived storms, hunger, and forced marches that would have broken lesser armies. And now, with Greece beneath their feet, they prepared for the clash that every man sensed was drawing near. The crossing of the Adriatic had set the stage. The siege lines at Dyrrachium marked the arena, and soon Caesar and Pompey, the two greatest commanders of their age, would meet face to face in a struggle that would decide not just the fate of the Republic, but the future shape of Rome itself. For now, though, Caesar tightened his grip on the Greek coast, awaiting the moment Antony would break the naval blockade and bring the rest of the legions across the sea. Only then would the true confrontation begin.